Lost your way, princess? The insult didn't come from a boy trying to impress his friends. It came from a man who knew exactly how to aim at a person's throat without leaving bruises. Master Chief Darnell Rask said it loud enough that everyone in the training lane heard it. And he said it with the relaxed confidence of someone who believed the entire world had been built for him and would stay that way as long as he kept his boot on the right neck. The swamp behind the compound was not part of the official course map, but everyone who had been through the pipeline knew it existed. It was a shallow basin full of dark water, slick mud, cypress knees, and the stale smell of things that had been rotting since the first time someone decided suffering was an efficient teaching tool. The instructors used it when they wanted to erase someone's pride quickly, because the swamp didn't just tire your body. It humiliated you, coated you in filth, stole your balance, and made you look weak in front of witnesses. Today, it had become a stage. 31 candidates stood in a ragged semicircle, wet from the earlier surf passage, salt dried white on their sleeves, sand grinding in their boots. Their faces carried the same exhausted expression, that hollow-eyed vigilance that comes from living under a stopwatch and being punished for every mistake, and yet their attention sharpened when the new candidate was marched to the edge of the water. They were tired, but not too tired to watch someone else suffer, and the shame of that curiosity flickered behind their eyes, even if none of them would admit out loud. Her name, Tape, read Serrano. She was shorter than most of them, lean in a way that suggested endurance rather than aesthetics, and she stood with a stillness that didn't belong in a place designed to make people jittery. Her wet hair had come loose from regulation and clung to her jawline. There was nothing glamorous about her, nothing delicate, nothing that fit the word princess, except the fact that she didn't flinch when men tried to reduce her to it. Rask stepped closer, stopping just short of the mud line. He wore the uniform like armor and rank like a weapon, and the candidates watched him the way people watch a storm approach when they can't run. "You've been here 3 days," he said, as if he were reading the sentence off a verdict. 3 days, and already you've made it everyone's problem that you're here at all. Serrano didn't answer. In this place, silence was either obedience or provocation, and Rask treated it like provocation. He paced slowly, making sure the entire semicircle could see his expression. "I've read your file, Serrano. I've read what they want us to believe about you, and I've read what they left out. A lot of blank space in there, isn't it? A lot of classified and restricted and not applicable for a candidate who's supposed to be just another body on a roster." A few candidates exchanged glances because everyone understood what blank space meant in the military. It meant someone higher than your pay grade had decided your story wasn't for public consumption. It also meant you could be a fraud with a fancy cover, and suspicion spread in an environment where trust was rationed like water. Rask's eyes dropped to Serrano's collar. A thin cord was visible there, dark against her skin, the knot tucked under fabric like something she didn't want anyone to notice. "What's that?" he asked. Serrano's gaze stayed forward, fixed on a point beyond him. "Personal item, Master Chief." He smiled without warmth. "Personal items are for people who get to go home at night. This program strips you down to what you are. You want to be treated the same as the men here? Then you don't get special little talismans." The candidates waited. They had seen instructors take wedding rings, prayer beads, lucky coins, and photos, not because those items were dangerous, but because hope could be used as leverage. Serrano's hand twitched once toward her chest, then stopped, and the movement was so small that most people would have missed it, but Rask didn't miss anything he could punish. "Take it off," he ordered. Serrano answered in the same calm tone. "No, Master Chief." The air shifted. A refusal like that was gasoline in a place run on fire. Rask's smile thinned, and he stepped in fast enough that the candidates heard the mud suck at his boot. He reached under Serrano's collar, hooked his fingers around the cord, and pulled until the pendant slipped into view. It was a small piece of metal, dull with wear, shaped like a flattened oval. Most people would not have recognized the faint imprint on one side, because it wasn't the clean official insignia you'd see on recruiting posters. It was older, simpler, the kind of symbol carved by someone who didn't want it to be recognized by strangers. Rask held it up as if he'd found contraband. "Well, look at that," he said. "You really did bring jewelry to a funeral." A few candidates laughed, partly because the joke landed and partly because they were relieved it wasn't aimed at them. Serrano didn't laugh. She didn't blink. She simply held still, shoulders square, face unreadable except for the slight tightening at the corners of her mouth, the kind of restraint that looked less like discipline and more like someone holding a door closed against something violent inside. Rask let the pendant fall back against her chest and then pointed to the swamp. "Get in," he said. Serrano stepped forward. The first touch of water climbed her boots and sank instantly into the fabric. The swamp was colder than it looked, a thick chill that clamped around her ankles and tried to steal sensation from her feet. She walked until the water reached her knees, then her thighs, and the mud began to tug at her boots with each step as if it resented her progress. The candidates watched her wade out, and some of their expressions changed because Serrano moved like someone who understood unstable terrain. She didn't stomp. She didn't rush. She tested the ground, shifted her weight, and kept her balance with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this somewhere worse, somewhere the penalty for falling wasn't laughter. Rask shouted, "Face down." Serrano lowered herself to her knees. For a second, the swamp went silent except for distant insects and the small, wet sounds of mud. Then Rask stepped forward and shoved her hard between the shoulder blades, driving her into the water. Her face struck something beneath the surface, and the sound that followed was not imagined. It was a sharp, wet crack that made several candidates wince. Blood immediately clouded the water, bright against black. Serrano's body went still. That stillness lasted long enough for people to think she might be unconscious. Then she exhaled slowly, pushed her palms into the muck, and began to rise. Rask didn't allow it yet. He planted his boot against the bank, leaned forward, and pressed her down again, holding her face in the swamp long enough that the candidates felt their own throats tighten just watching. He held her there not to teach her anything about drowning, but to teach everyone else something about power. When he finally released her, Serrano surged up with controlled movement, water pouring from her hair, mud coating her cheek, blood streaming from her nose in a steady line that ran over her lips. She inhaled once, sharply, then steadied her breath as if she were choosing calm on purpose. The candidates laughed again, but it sounded different now, thinner. Because the blood made it real, and reality has a way of silencing bravado when it's inconvenient. Rask circled her with the swagger of a man who believed humiliation was evidence. "This," he said loudly, "is what happens when someone confuses paperwork with capability. You don't belong here, Serrano. You're a publicity project, a social experiment, a distraction." He stopped close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath. "You want to prove you're one of them?" he asked. "Then stand there and take it. That's what warriors do." Serrano straightened until she stood at attention in the swamp, mud dragging at her uniform, blood sliding down her chin. Her eyes remained fixed past him. In the semicircle, one candidate didn't laugh. His name Tape Red Mills, and he was the kind of quiet man who usually survived because he didn't draw attention. He shifted as if he wanted to speak, then swallowed it because the program punished sympathy as weakness just as aggressively as it punished failure. On the raised platform near the lane, Commander Iris Caldwell watched without expression, but her eyes narrowed. Caldwell was not one of the instructors who treated cruelty like tradition. She treated it like a liability. She had spent enough of her career around rail operators to know the difference between toughening and breaking, and she had seen enough broken people to recognize the moment a line was crossed. She didn't intervene yet because the program was a machine, and machines did not stop for discomfort. Instead, she watched Serrano's posture, her breathing, the way her hands remained steady at her sides despite pain and cold and humiliation. Serrano stood there like someone refusing to give a bully the one thing he needed most. A reaction. Rask finally stepped back. "Get out," he said. "Clean yourself up. Report to medical. Then report to my office." And Serrano, he added, his voice dropping into something personal, "Next time you refuse an order, you won't leave the swamp." Serrano walked out without looking at him, water streaming from her sleeves, boots sucking free of mud with each step. She moved like she was carrying something heavier than her ruck, and the candidates watched her go, their laughter dying in their throats. Most of them thought they had witnessed the beginning of her end. They were wrong. Serrano made it to the barracks and locked herself into the small bathroom stall at the end of the hall, the one with the flickering light that nobody liked. She stripped off her soaked top and leaned over the sink, staring at her reflection. Her nose was crooked, not catastrophically, but enough that the angle was wrong, enough that she could feel the throbbing pulse of it in her skull. Blood had dried at the edges of her nostrils, and mud was caked under one, like bruising. She looked like someone who had been dragged out of a ditch. Her hands finally trembled, but not from cold. The trembling came from a place deeper than adrenaline. She gripped the sink hard until the tremor slowed, then reached under her collar and pulled the pendant free. It rested in her palm like a small weight, familiar as a heartbeat. On one side was a symbol, a simple trident with a small star punched above it, an old team mark that meant nothing to people outside a very narrow world. On the other side were 4 words, scratched in a handwriting that had once been steadier than hers. Don't let them take you. Her thumb traced the letters, and her throat tightened as the memory rose. A metal container, a dark room, a voice in her ear telling her to breathe, telling her to stay quiet, telling her that panic would kill her faster than the enemy ever could. That voice had belonged to Senior Chief Evan Serrano, her father. The world knew him as a training accident, a man lost in a routine dive mishap years ago. That was the official story, the clean one, the kind that fit on a folded flag and allowed a family to grieve without asking questions that would never be answered. Serrano knew better. She had been 14 when he disappeared, old enough to see the fear in her mother's eyes when the uniformed men came to the door and refused to meet her gaze. Old enough to understand that the silence that followed was not respect, but containment. 2 weeks after the funeral, a plain envelope arrived with no return address. Inside was the pendant and a single line typed on paper that wasn't official and yet carried more authority than any letterhead she had ever seen. If you ever need the truth, earn it. She had spent years trying to earn it. She enlisted young, moved fast, tested high, and kept her mouth shut when people asked why. She volunteered for billets other people avoided, trained harder than required, and accepted assignments that came with extra briefings and fewer details. She learned to disappear into bureaucracy and then reappear where she was needed, because the fastest way to be underestimated was to look ordinary and let people tell themselves whatever story they preferred. Eventually, the right person noticed. Eventually, the right door opened. Not with a ceremony, not with a handshake, but with a quiet phone call and a flight that wasn't on the schedule board. She had walked into a room where everyone spoke softly and carried themselves like weapons. And she had been told that her father's death wasn't what she'd been led to believe. She had been told that he didn't die in a training accident. He died on a night the government would never admit happened, killing the kind of men who did not die easily, and saving teammates whose names would never be public. He died doing exactly what he had trained others to do: go into the dark and come back with a problem handled. Serrano had listened without moving, because she had learned early that grief was safest when kept private. Then she had been offered a path. She took it. For 3 years, she lived inside a world that left no headlines and collected no applause. She learned to run missions that ended before anyone knew they had begun, and she learned to carry the consequences afterward without explanation. She became the kind of operator people whispered about in hallways without using names, the one who appeared when things had already gone wrong and left after they were fixed. And then, after a mission that went sideways in a place no one was supposed to be, she requested something no one expected. She asked to come here, to the pipeline, to the place where people used pain as truth. Because if she could survive this, she could stand in the daylight without lying about what she was, and she could build something that didn't need secrecy to matter. She stared at her reflection again, blood and mud and a crooked nose, and the sting behind her eyes threatened to break loose. She let the tears come silently, just once, because there were some things even legends were allowed to feel when no one was watching. When the tears stopped, she rinsed her face, retied the pendant cord with steady hands, and tucked it back under her collar. Then she walked out and went to medical. Commander Caldwell called her into an office just before midnight. The room smelled like stale coffee and paperwork. A single desk lamp cast sharp light over a folder that lay open, its pages marked with redactions and clipped memos. Serrano entered with her nose taped and her uniform clean, though the bruising had begun to bloom under the skin. She stood at attention, expression neutral, as if she hadn't been driven face first into the swamp hours earlier. Caldwell studied her for a long moment. "How bad is the pain?" she asked. Serrano answered honestly. "Manageable, ma'am." Caldwell tapped the folder. "Master Chief Rask submitted a recommendation," she said. "Immediate removal. He claims you failed under stress and showed inability to maintain composure." Serrano's face did not change. "Understood." Caldwell leaned back slightly, her gaze sharp. "You're not going to argue?" Serrano paused. "No, ma'am." "Why not?" "Because it wouldn't matter," Serrano said. "He doesn't want facts. He wants confirmation." Caldwell's mouth tightened. She had expected defensiveness, anger, pleading, anything that fit the narrative of a candidate under threat. Serrano offered none of it. Caldwell turned a page in the folder and said quietly, "Your record is unusual." Serrano did not respond. Caldwell continued, "There are assignments here I can't access, and I'm cleared higher than most people on this base. There are periods where you effectively don't exist." Serrano's eyes remained forward. "Yes, ma'am." Caldwell exhaled slowly. "I'm not going to ask you to explain what I'm not authorized to know," she said, and the words were careful, because Caldwell understood that questions could be dangerous in certain corners of the military. "But I'm going to ask you one thing." Serrano waited. Caldwell's voice dropped slightly. "Did you come here to prove a point, or did you come here to finish something?" Serrano's jaw tightened just enough to reveal the truth beneath restraint. "I came here to finish, ma'am." Caldwell nodded once, as if that was the answer she'd hoped for. "Then here's what I can offer you." She slid the folder aside and opened a second one, thinner, marked with a classification stamp Serrano recognized even without reading it. "There's an accelerated assessment," Caldwell said. 30 hours. Continuous evaluation. Events designed to break leadership under fatigue. Almost nobody passes it without preparation, and if you fail, your removal becomes permanent and justified on paper. Serrano's expression remained steady. "When does it start?" Caldwell's eyebrows lifted, not in surprise exactly, but in recognition. 0-100. Serrano nodded once. "I'll be ready." Caldwell studied her again, then said, "One more thing. Rask will be observing. He will be looking for any excuse to claim you were carried." Serrano's voice came out quiet. "Then he won't find one." Caldwell held Serrano's gaze for a long moment, then stood. "Dismissed," she said, and it sounded less like an order and more like permission. Serrano turned and left, and Caldwell watched her go with the uneasy feeling that she had just put a match near gasoline, because a person like Rask did not accept being proven wrong. He turned it into a crusade. The assessment began under floodlights and cold wind. The first event was water, because the program always started with the thing that made people panic, and panic was the quickest way to reveal who you were when control slipped. The candidates entered the bay in full gear, the weight dragging them down immediately. The water was colder than expected, and the shock stole breath even from trained swimmers. Evaluators watched from boats, clipboards ready, eyes indifferent. Nobody cared about effort. They cared about results. Serrano moved into the water like she belonged to it. Not because she was fast, but because she didn't fight the ocean. She let it move around her and used its rhythm rather than trying to conquer it. Her breathing stayed controlled, even when a wave slapped her face and the taped nose throbbed anew. Halfway through the swim, one candidate began to flail, his strokes turning frantic. An evaluator leaned forward, ready to signal for extraction. Serrano adjusted her line, reached him, and without slowing her own pace too much, guided his arm into a rhythm that kept him moving. She didn't drag him, because that would cost her. She simply stabilized him long enough for him to regain control. Then she continued on as if she had never deviated. When she hit the exit point and stood, dripping, she did it without ceremony. The evaluators noted the time and the intervention, and one of them frowned slightly, as if trying to place her. The second event was a ruck run through sand and scrub, the kind that shredded ankles and made shoulders bleed where straps rubbed raw. The pace was brutal. The weight was heavy enough to warp posture. The route cut through low terrain that trapped humidity and made breathing feel like pulling air through cloth. Candidates began to fall behind in the first hour. By the second hour, some were running on stubbornness alone. Serrano kept her pace steady, not sprinting, not showing off, simply moving like a metronome. Blood seeped under her tape, and sweat stung her eyes, but her gaze remained forward. If you've ever seen someone who knows how to suffer efficiently, you know what it looks like. It isn't dramatic. It isn't loud. It's simply relentless. At mile 12, a hallucination hit one candidate hard enough that he stumbled into a ditch and lay there blinking at the sky like he couldn't understand where he was. Evaluators moved in. Serrano did not stop, because the assessment was designed to punish kindness when it interfered with completion, but she did glance down long enough to note his breathing, his responsiveness, and the fact that he was alive. She crossed the finish line inside the time limit with seconds to spare and stood at attention, chest rising and falling in controlled rhythm. The third event was navigation, because fatigue turns simple math into a labyrinth and terrain into a liar. They sent Serrano into the swamp again, but this time it wasn't a punishment lane with witnesses. It was night. It was silence. It was coordinates and darkness, and the feeling that the world had narrowed to a compass needle and your own judgment. The swamp tried to swallow her boots, and branches scratched at her sleeves, but Serrano moved through it with the patient confidence of someone who had navigated worse places under higher stakes. Twice she stopped to confirm her bearing by terrain association, aligning her mental map with the shape of the land, and each time she moved again without hesitation. She found every checkpoint. She returned early. An evaluator looked up as she emerged from the tree line, mud on her knees, face streaked with sweat and swamp water, eyes clear despite exhaustion. "You're ahead of time," he said. "Yes, Chief," Serrano replied. He studied her for a beat too long. "Where'd you learn to move like that?" Serrano didn't answer. She handed him her card and stood still while he punched it. The fourth event was medical, because leadership isn't just about pulling triggers. It's about keeping people alive when everything is loud and wrong. They presented her with a simulated casualty, massive bleeding, airway compromise, signs of shock. The clock started. Serrano moved with methodical precision, applying pressure, placing a tourniquet, checking airway, calling for evac in the correct format. Her voice did not rise. Her hands did not fumble. She spoke into the radio like she had done it on a real net, with real blood, in real darkness. When she finished inside the time limit, the evaluators exchanged glances. Because competence at that level under that fatigue wasn't common. It was learned the hard way. The fifth event was the leadership crucible. They gave Serrano 2 teammates, then cut them away. A simulated ambush erupted, blank rounds cracking, smoke throwing shadows, instructors shouting conflicting orders. Her teammates dropped as casualties, and suddenly Serrano was alone with 2 wounded bodies and a problem designed to overload her decision-making. In the chaos, candidates often made one of 2 mistakes. They froze, or they acted blindly. Serrano did neither. She established cover first, returned controlled fire, then moved to the casualty with the highest chance of survival and stabilized him while maintaining security. She communicated with command in clean, precise brevity, requested support, and planned an extraction route that avoided the obvious kill zone. It was not just correct, it was calm. Master Chief Rask watched from a rise, his face tight, his posture rigid. He had expected Serrano to crumble under pressure, to prove his worldview right. Instead, he watched her solve the scenario like she had been born for it, and something like fear flickered in his expression, because he could no longer pretend she was unqualified. Now he had to face the worst truth. She was qualified, and he had treated her like trash anyway. The final gate was close quarters, because no matter how tough you are, you can still fail when the margins shrink to inches. The shoot house was a maze of doors and corners, hostages and targets, split-second decisions. Candidates entered exhausted and left either validated or broken. Serrano entered with controlled breathing, weapon at the ready, movements crisp. She cleared rooms without rushing, identified threats without hesitation, and fired only when she was sure. The shots landed where they needed to land. No hostage casualties, no friendly fire, no wasted motion. When she exited into gray morning light, she looked like a person held together by will and training, not by luck. Mud streaked her sleeves. Sweat soaked her collar. Blood had dried under her tape again. She did not smile. She simply stood and waited. The briefing room felt too clean for what had happened outside. Fluorescent lights buzzed. Chairs were arranged in rows. Instructors lined the front wall with clipboards, faces unreadable. Candidates filed in, bruised and hollow-eyed, and took their seats. Serrano sat near the back, posture straight, hands resting calmly on her thighs, as if she had slept 8 hours instead of operating on fumes. Master Chief Rask sat in the front row, arms crossed, jaw clenched. He looked like a man waiting for the universe to correct itself. Commander Caldwell stepped to the podium, a tablet in her hands. She looked over the room once, then began. Candidate Serrano completed all events within standard, she said. Her performance met or exceeded benchmarks across every category. A ripple went through the room, because passing it all was rare under acceleration, and exceeding benchmarks was rarer. Caldwell continued. Her navigation time is among the fastest recorded this year. Her medical execution was clean under fatigue. Her leadership under ambush conditions was rated exceptional by every evaluator. Rask's fingers tightened on his bicep. Caldwell paused, then said, "She passed." Silence. Rask stood abruptly. "No," he said, voice sharp. "This is wrong." Caldwell's gaze snapped to him. "Sit down, Master Chief." Rask did not sit. "You're protecting her. You're forcing a narrative." Caldwell's voice turned cold. "You assaulted her." Rask sneered. "I trained her. I made her better." Caldwell didn't flinch. "You broke her nose in an unauthorized evolution and held her face underwater. That is not training. That is abuse." Rask's eyes darted toward Serrano, as if she were a threat that needed to be neutralized. "Her file is a joke," he snapped. "It's empty. It's redacted. Anyone can hide behind classified and claim there's something they aren't. She could be lying." Caldwell exhaled slowly, then said, "Master Chief, you have been wrong about her since the moment you decided to hate what she represents." Rask's voice rose. "She doesn't belong here." The ugliness landed, heavy in the quiet room. Caldwell turned to the side table and opened a sealed envelope with controlled movements, as if she wanted everyone to understand that what came next was not rumor. "This morning," she said, "Naval Special Warfare Command responded to a clearance-verified query regarding candidate Serrano's restricted service." The room stiffened. Caldwell continued. "Portions of her record are classified because she served under special authorities and in units that are not publicly acknowledged. She was attached to an elite operational element conducting missions in denied areas. Those missions remain classified." Rask's face went pale. Caldwell turned her gaze toward Serrano. "Stand," she said. Serrano rose. No triumph, no theatrics, no victory lap. She simply stood as if this was another evolution. Caldwell nodded once. "Show them what you wear." Serrano reached under her collar and pulled out the pendant. The metal caught the light. Some candidates stared blankly, seeing only a small object. A few instructors, however, recognized enough to go still. Caldwell said, "That pendant belonged to Senior Chief Evan Serrano." A quiet sound moved through the room, because even without details, the name carried weight for people who lived close enough to the classified world to hear whispers. Caldwell continued, "He was not lost in a training accident. He was killed on an operation that remains classified after saving teammates. That is documented under seal." Rask's mouth opened, but no words came. Caldwell's voice hardened. After his death, his daughter was recruited. She completed selection. She served. She earned commendations you will never see on a public page. Then she requested this pipeline because she chose to build instead of remain in the shadows. Rask shook his head, desperate. This is bullshit. You can't. Caldwell cut him off. You called her a princess and tried to drown her for refusing to surrender a memorial item. You attempted to remove her with false claims. You did it because you were afraid of what it meant if she succeeded. Rask's eyes snapped to Serrano. Hatred and fear tangled together. Serrano spoke then, her voice low but clear. My father taught me that real strength is not measured by who you can humiliate, she said. It's measured by who you protect when no one is watching. She held the pendant up and turned it so the room could see the engraving on the back. Don't let them take you. Serrano's gaze met Rask's. You tried to take me, she said quietly. Not because I was weak. Because you needed me to be. Rask's face twitched as if he wanted to shout, but his body didn't know where to put the collapse of his certainty. Commander Caldwell turned to the doorway. Master-at-arms, she called. 2 uniformed security personnel stepped in. Caldwell's tone became formal. Master Chief Darnell Rask, you are relieved of duty effective immediately. An investigation will be initiated regarding abuse of authority and assault. You will have no further contact with candidate Serrano. Rask stood frozen for a long moment, as if his brain refused to accept consequences. Then he walked toward the exit with stiff, uncertain steps. He did not look back. The door closed behind him, and the room remained silent in the aftermath. Then candidate Mills stood. He didn't grin. He didn't perform. He simply brought his hands together in a single deliberate clap, then another, and the sound was quiet at first, almost hesitant like people testing whether they were allowed to change. One by one, the other candidates stood. The applause grew, not wild, not celebratory, but steady and heavy with meaning. Serrano remained still. Her expression didn't soften into a smile, because some victories aren't joyful. Some are simply necessary. She lowered the pendant back under her collar and stood through the applause like a person who had finally stopped asking permission to exist. 3 weeks later, Serrano stood at the same swamp at dawn, but the air had changed. The water lay still. A thin mist hovered over the surface. The training lane was quiet except for distant footsteps as a new class assembled. Commander Caldwell walked up beside Serrano and stopped at the waterline. Do you want it removed from the course? Caldwell asked, nodding toward the swamp. Serrano looked out over the dark water, remembering blood in it, remembering laughter, remembering the moment she decided not to break. No, Serrano said. Keep it. Caldwell glanced at her. Why? Serrano's answer took a moment, as if she wanted to be sure it was true before she said it aloud. Because people need to see what they can survive, she said. But they also need to learn the difference between training and cruelty. Caldwell nodded slowly. You've been reassigned, she said. Integration Evaluation Team. You'll build standards. You'll mentor the next wave. Serrano exhaled once, a small release she didn't allow often. Good, she said. That's why I came. Footsteps approached, and candidate Mills appeared, looking unsure, like a man about to step onto a new kind of ground. He stopped beside Serrano and stared into the swamp. My sister enlisted, he said suddenly, the confession blunt in the quiet morning. She wrote me last night. She wants to do this. She wants to be here. Serrano didn't turn. And you're scared, she said, not as a question. Mills swallowed. Yeah. Serrano's hand moved to her collar, fingers brushing the pendant under fabric, not for comfort, but for memory. Tell her this, Serrano said. Tell her the swamp doesn't decide who she is. People try to decide, but they don't get to keep that power unless she hands it to them. Mills nodded slowly, like the words were landing in a place he didn't know existed. Serrano finally looked at him. Her eyes were tired but steady. And if anyone calls her princess like it's an insult, Serrano added, tell her to keep walking anyway. Mills raised his hand in a quiet salute, not flashy, not performative. Serrano returned it, equally calm. Then she turned and walked away from the swamp as the sun rose, the mist thinning behind her. The new class watched her go with a strange silence, because the story had already started spreading in whispers through the compound, and people were learning what bullies always learn too late. Mockery is easy when you think you're safe. It gets harder when you realize the person you try to drown is the one who knows how to breathe under pressure better than anyone in the room. And it gets impossible when you finally understand the truth. She was never lost. They were.